how did Vince put you and Jimmy and Mike Hart together? What was the mindset behind finally doing something with you?
Well, I had, your first impressions are everything. Like your first audition. Like I had a huge knee surgery in July of 1984. I injured it in January and limped through January, February, March, April, May, and June because I didn't have the connections then to get a quick appointment with a doctor and get some surgery. But my knee was really badly injured, and I sort of hobbled along all winter, and finally I got some surgery done in July, which was like the big zipper all the way up my knee. And then they told me I'd be off 6 months with the bad knee, with the recovery. And that's when WWE came to Calgary and told my dad that they wanted to buy him out. And I remember they had a conversation with me while I was still convalescing on my knee. Looking at me, you couldn't tell I had knee surgery, but this is maybe about 3 weeks after. But I was still limping around and pretty feeble on my knee. And they said they were going to make me a big star in New York, and that Vince was going to take over and want to bring you in. You're going to work with all the top guys and be a main event guy, and we have big plans for you and all this stuff. And I'm like, I don't believe any of it. To be honest, I really wanted to quit the business. I'd had enough. I'd been working for my dad for 6 years at that point, and I was really tired and road worn and didn't want to do it anymore. And I was kind of hoping that something would put me on a different path. But I remember I said, well, I'll give it a try. And eventually that's what happened. The WWE bought my dad out. They never paid him. They never paid my dad one penny, and they stiffed him. They bought the territory for $750,000, and he never saw one penny for it. I never knew that till the end of my career, that they never paid him. And my dad took his TV show off the air, and it was WWE all of a sudden in Calgary. And one of the first things they did is fly me and Dynamite Kid down. And Dynamite Kid didn't want to go. He was very suspicious, Dynamite was making a lot of big money in Japan, and he did not want to go to WWE. He kind of knew it as I did back in those days. WWE was considered the big man territory, where everybody there was 6'4" and 300 pounds. They all wrestled like dinosaurs. It was big muscle guys and big, humongous wrestlers. And so he was like, we're never going to make it down there. Guys yours and my size are going to be ignored there. And he was probably right about that, but WWE was taking over in a different way. They were going to change wrestling. And I don't think Dynamite understood that, nor I did necessarily at the time. But anyway, so they flew me and Dynamite down, and I could barely, my knee was still really bad. And I hadn't had a match, really hadn't had a real match or like a great match in probably since February of that year. So it'd been 7 months or so since I really could run and do stuff. But even at this time after the surgery, it's about 3 or 4 weeks after my surgery, and they flew us down for our first audition. And it's on tape somewhere, but and it wasn't like it was so bad, but to understand wrestling at that time, these were what you call TV squash matches, where it's me and Dynamite Kid teamed up against 2 guys. One was a guy that I knew, a guy named Mike Sharp, who was a big 6'4", just a huge guy. And they told us, you guys are winning, and you got 3.5 minutes, go, kind of thing. And it's like, how do you wrestle a match in 3.5 minutes? I've never had a 3.5 minute wrestling match in my whole life. It was a hard adjustment for me to condense everything down and to basically just go out there and kind of do a wrestling match with a little bit of we swap a couple moves back and forth, and then you beat somebody. I didn't know how to do that so well. And for the end of the match, they Dynamite slammed the guy in. I did something where I was supposed to slam the guy for Dynamite. Dynamite was going to do the flying headbutt off the top, which was his finishing move. So I slammed the guy, but I guess I slammed him facing the wrong way. And I remember Dynamite was standing on the corner. He's like, everybody looked at me and goes like, for sakes. And I'm like, cut me some slack. I got a bad knee and haven't wrestled in 5 months and my timing's all off and everything. And anyway, so I had to go back and slam the guy and move him into a different position. And even then, I guess I slammed the guy too close to Dynamite. Dynamite had to do his headbutt, like where he just kind of fell off the corner. But he was kind of not mad, but kind of like, I remember him like shaking his head and like rolling his eyes at sort of that I didn't make him look good either. But and I remember that 1, 2, 3, and then we started walking back to the curtain. I remember thinking I screwed up everything. It certainly wasn't the best match for me because I could barely kind of walk around in there without letting on that I was injured. And I had told them all this. I've just had knee surgery, and I really shouldn't be in a wrestling match right now. But I'll go out there just to show you that to try to be a trooper kind of thing. But I remember when I walked back, and I knew it was a pretty lousy match for me. Like it wasn't. I didn't really shine very good. And we came back through the curtain. I remember Vince McMahon just ignored me completely. He just never even looked at me. Like I walked past him, and he was almost like I knew it's like I didn't make a very good impression on him. And then as soon as Dynamite came back, he was like all gushing about Dynamite, fantastic, and loved your match, slapping him on the back. But anyway, that for me, I failed my first audition. And, then I went to Japan for about 4 weeks right after that. And then I came back, and the day I came home from Japan, I started full-time for WWE. And I was the only guy that was full-time. Dynamite quit because they paid us that day for the TV tapings. They paid Dynamite and me $50 they flew us all the way in, and we had to pay our own hotel, and we had to pay our own trans, and they took up our airfare, but that was it. And Dynamite got $50, and I got $50, and they said that's what we pay everybody for TV taping. We get $50, and Canadian too. So Dynamite was like, thanks for the $50. You guys can go F yourselves. I'm done here. I'll never work for you guys again, and don't call me again. But for me, I didn't have any other job, so I didn't have Japan. Although I was working in Japan, I wasn't really as big a star. The big thing for me wasn't going to be Japan. But the first impression is a big thing in wrestling, and my first impression from them was that, okay, this guy's he's not very good. And I was like, so then it was, once I started getting my timing and I got back to working every day, and they brought me in, and I was plus one other match for really, honest to God, for almost 7 months. They never put my name on a program. There was never Bret Hart from Calgary, or it was just plus one other match. So I didn't have any TV time. Nobody knew who I was. When I walked out, you could hear a pin drop when they announced my name. Bret Hart from Canada was like, nobody knows who I am. Even the wrestlers in the dressing room, I had no clout with anybody. Being a promoter's kid is probably the worst, because most promoters' kids are, spoiled sort of brats that have no wrestling ability and all that, and weren't very good, most of them. And so I was kind of shut out by everybody. Nobody, unless I worked with somebody in Japan or they worked for my dad somewhere, and they knew who I was or liked me, which most of them didn't. So I had zero credibility, or no one paid any attention to me. If anything, they ignored me every night. And I went like that for about 7 months, where I kept being plus one other match and plus one other match. And they said, don't worry, we're going to come up with something for you. And I could tell the big thing that happened was the Bulldogs did get signed. I kept telling the Bulldogs, like, you guys should come to New York. It's going to be great for you. And I remember Dynamite going, look what they're doing with you. And I'm like, don't worry about what they're doing with me, but they got big plans for you guys. He's like, yeah, sure they do. And he wouldn't even entertain the idea of going WWE. He was like, if anything, they were like, based on how they were using me, they figured the same for themselves. And but I kept telling them that it was an opportunity, because I knew, like in WWE at that time, that when I first went to WWE, when I came back from Japan, every building was sold out, especially in the States. But they were doing huge business, and on a level that I never could have imagined. Like I remember wrestling in Los Angeles and all the big cities from East. I went my first 14 days around the road for WWE were everywhere. I was in all the big cities. I went from Atlanta to San Diego, I was crisscross the country a couple of times. And after you realize like every night it's a sellout, whether even if Hulk Hogan's not on the card, it's sold out. Junkyard Dog is selling the place out. And business was just booming. And I remember it's like, okay, so these guys are definitely going to make it. They're a big time wrestling company now that's putting everybody out. They're going to put everybody out of business. But nobody really believed that. Like when I come home and tell my brothers and tell Dynamite and Davey that you guys got to get down there. There's nothing but money to be made, and I won't make any, but you guys are going to do great. And one day they just showed up. They were in the dressing room, or not even in the dressing room. They had flew into the Toronto, and we were going up to the TV tapings. And I remember Davey telling me that when the Bulldogs signed their contract with Vince up in a hotel room, that as soon as he signed, because he wanted the Bulldogs for 3 or 4 months. In fact, most of my conversations with Vince were about, what are the Bulldogs doing? Can you talk to the Bulldogs about coming in? He really wanted, actually they weren't even called the Bulldogs yet. They were Dynamite and Davey. But he really wanted them. And when they did sign that day, that was probably about a month before WrestleMania 1. They signed with the WWE, and I remember Davey telling me how Vince jumped up on the little table that they had in there, like a little coffee table, but he did like a little dance on the table. He was so happy that the Bulldogs signed. And and then they started thinking about doing something with me. I think it was around it might have been the same night that they said, we got big plans for you. You're going to be Cowboy Bret Hart. And we're going to put you in a cowboy hat. We're going to put you you're going to have like a white cowboy vest with fringe and stuff like that. And you're going to have chaps, and you're going to ride out to the ring and on a horse. We'll have a different horse in every arena. And you're going to be Cowboy Bret Hart. I remember he's trying to paint the picture for me. And I remember he goes, they're going to put the toy horse is going to be with your figure in the box. I remember that's what kind of got me. It's like, really? All right, I'm in. I'll be Cowboy Bret Hart. I remember it's like, take it, jump for it, go for it. And then I got in the car, and Jim Neidhart had been in WWE with me since about January that year. And I remember they got in the car with him and Adrian Adonis, and we drove all the way up to the TV tapings, a town called Brantford, Ontario, which is about an hour and a half from Toronto. But the whole way up, I remember telling them, I said, they're going to call me Cowboy Bret Hart. They're going to tell him with the horse in the box. I remember telling them. I remember Jim laughing his head off, and Adrian both laughing. And they ribbed me all the way up to the little town about how funny it was going to be Cowboy Bret Hart. And they were starting to call me Cowboy by the time I got out of the car and stuff. And somehow they totally changed my mind. Where I was like, oh, they're right. Cowboy Bret Hart could be a huge mistake. I hate cowboy boots. I can't ride a horse to save my life. And where I come from, you better be a real cowboy, if you want to pretend to be a cowboy. I remember thinking, it's a bad idea. I'm gonna go back and tell them I don't want to do it. So I remember that night after the tapings, which are long nights, they're long nights, and the guy that was in charge was a guy named George Scott. But I knocked on his door about 1 a.m, and he was just getting ready to climb under the covers, and he looked really tired. And I knocked on his door, and I said, George, I changed my mind. I don't want to be Cowboy Bret Hart. And he was like, you're kidding me. It's the biggest thing we've ever, it's going to be huge for me. We've given you on a silver platter, this is going to be huge, Cowboy Bret Hart. And I just said, I'm not a cowboy, and I can't do it, and I don't want to do it. And I remember thinking when I was saying it, you just blew the biggest opportunity of your life by letting Jim Neidhart and Adrian Adonis kind of rib you about it. And I remember I said, I don't know where it came from. I really don't, because it came right out of my head without any thinking. I said, why don't you tag me up with Jim Neidhart? He's managed by Jimmy Hart. Call us the Hart Foundation. And he said to me, I remember he patted me on the shoulder. He goes, you could never be a bad guy. You're a nice looking kid, and you're a baby face. You're a baby face, and that's all there is to it. But he goes, don't worry, we'll come up with something for you. And it was kind of like, so I killed that idea. And then I was back to plus one other match for another couple of weeks. And luckily for me, right around the time I called to quit, when I called to quit, I remember he goes, I called him up in the morning. I said, George, I said, this is about 3 weeks later. I said, what are your plans for me? What are you going to do with me? And he goes, I think he knew my next words were going to be, well, I'm going to finish up. I'm going to quit and go home. And I don't know, they didn't care either, but I think they were like, they'll give me something. And he said, we're going to do exactly what you wanted. We're going to tag you up with Jim Neidhart and tag you with, you're going to be a heel and you're going to be called the Hart Foundation. And I was like, okay. And I was like, I hung up the phone and I thought, that'll be perfect. That'll be good. Now I have to go talk to Jim about it. And luckily for me, Jim was totally cool with the idea right off the bat, which I was lucky because a lot of guys might have said, the hell, I don't want to be your partner. I don't need to be tagged up with you. I'm doing great in singles and stuff like that. But luckily for me, Jim had, was a good friend of mine and I think knew that I was a better wrestler than I was getting credit for.
And I was curious about, because when you and Jim were wrestling in WWF or before that, you guys were like wrestlers. You would go out every night and wrestle. And then you go to WWF and they're making action figures for people. There's Pile Driver, the wrestling album. Vince McMahon's doing Stand Back. How did you kind of acclimatize to that absolute mentalness of late 80s WWF?
Well, when I first went to WWF, the Tonga Kid was doing some storyline with Jimmy Snuka. He'd only been in the business about 10 minutes. He was like 19 or something. And he got a check for, supposedly, I don't know how true this is, I never saw the check, but he got a check for 1 week's work for like 15 or 20 grand or something like that. And he turned it in and quit because it wasn't enough. And I remember it was like, I was making in those days maybe $700 a week wrestling for my dad 7 days a week, which was decent for after 6 years of hard labor. And then when I went to WWE, I remember I really was, in my mind, is like the first check, I'm going to quit. They're going to fire me any day now, but if my check is lousy check, the first check I get, if it's I'm going to quit. I'm just going to go home because I'm tired of being on the road. And so I remember I got my first check and was like, I was like nobody on the card plus one of the match. And I got a check for like $3,500 US for my first week working for WWE, something like that. And I remember as soon as I got the check, I called home and told my first wife. I called her and I said, I'm going to be here a long time. And I remember it was a big thing to me. Suddenly even though I was nobody and I was nobody and not in a big position, I was making more money than I ever made in my life. But we hear about what other guys were making. Like I just said, Tom Kidd was main event with Snuka and made, I think 15 grand, might have been just for Madison Square Garden. And he quit because they felt he should have got more pay. And so you start to see a lot of guys making money. And I can remember the Iron Sheik, for example, opening up his check in the dressing room. He got his very first the action figures came out, those rubber wrestling dolls came out. And there was only about 6 figures. Like there was Hogan, Sergeant Slaughter, Iron Sheik. Anyway, it was about 6 figures, 6 wrestling action figures they first came out with. They sold like crazy. And I remember Iron Sheik got a check in the dressing room for, I think it was $100,000 or close to it. And he opened it in the dressing room and he brought her over to, he goes, how much is this? He thought it was $99. And so, I mean, you see it, it's like, that's $100,000 check. And it was the first one for the quarter. Like might be 3 more of those coming in the year. And so everybody wanted an action figure now. Like everyone's like, I can't wait. And that's probably where I was like, my horse is going to be in the box. But it was a big, there was a lot of money to be made. And it was, there was other guys, they hand out these royalty checks for, like, if you bought a Hulk Hogan doll, you got to get the Iron Sheik doll to wrestle with. So Sheik made more money than he knew what to do with. and Bundy, you know, like his figure is like, so there's a lot of certain, like 6 guys would make a lot of money, the first 6, and then the next 6. I remember by the time they came out with my action figure was like in the, like after like the 40th wrestling figure that made, like, or maybe even 50th, or I remember my royalty checks were much smaller than that. And it was like, I missed the flood of the real gravy that came with that. And I was a little late in the game on that one.